Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Carpenters Q&A. I'm Chris May. Today I am delighted to interview legendary drummer Cubby O'Brien, probably best known for his work on the Mickey Mouse Club, starting in 1955 as Cubby the Mouseketeer. He went on to play with a number of celebrated artists over the years, was the on-camera drummer for the Burnett show starting around 1967 through roughly 1972. But today we're going to talk about his work with the Carpenters, Karen and Richard. This is an interview that I've been looking forward to doing for quite some time, and we just weren't able to get it together due to scheduling conflicts and whatnot, but we finally managed to pull it off, and we're going to get to spend a few minutes together. So without further ado, let's move into that interview. Well, Cubby, I am so excited to finally be doing this interview with you. We've been talking about it for some time. In fact, last year I had invited you to the Carpenters' 55th anniversary celebration out in Downey, and you were tied up. You had a lot going on there. And then we attempted to tape an episode for this podcast, and there were technical issues on my end, and so we never got to it. And I mentioned to my wife about a week and a half ago, I said, if I don't get this interview nailed down with him, this is going to be the biggest missed opportunity of my life. So thank you for being so flexible and on such short notice. It's so great to have you here.
Good. Glad to be here.
A lot of what I want to spend time talking about today is your work with the Carpenters, really from 1973 to 81-ish. But for the uninitiated, can you sort of give me the nutshell? You were raised in a musical family. Let's just go back to when you were young. You got involved. Dad was a well-known big band drummer.
Right.
Older brothers that played. And then, of course, you had a tremendous history with Disney. I'm going to let you just kind of guide us through that, if you would.
Well, my dad started giving me drum lessons when I was about 5 because I was banging on everything in the house. And I made a little drum set out of some old pots and pans in the backyard. And he said, I think it's time for you to start taking lessons. So I did. And then I started playing in this little Dixieland band, and we played shows around LA, little things around LA. And one of those shows was for the Screen Actors Guild. And there were some Disney producers at that show, and they were just starting to look for kids for the Mickey Mouse Club. And they asked me to come down and audition, and I auditioned. And after a couple auditions, I got the show. They put me together with Karen, and we became kind of like Cubby and Karen on the show. And then I spent 3 years with them. It was, it was great.
What was that? I mean, at what point in there, because I had heard a rumor, and of course, you always got to kind of cringe when you hear that, somebody sets it up with, I heard a rumor but Walt Disney, I mean, how involved was he at this time with the show or with you? Did you had a chance to meet him and work with him at all? Or was he just sort of on the sidelines?
No, he was on the set a lot. Wow. And if any of us had a birthday or something, he'd bring down a sheet cake with a Mickey Mouse on it, and we'd stop production for a half hour and have cake, and he was there. And we did some scenes with him. I've actually got it on CDs. And he was around a lot. This was his big baby. This was, right after Disneyland had opened. Mm-hmm. And in October of that same year is when ABC aired the Mickey Mouse Club. So it was a big year for him, 1955.
Wow. Well, and then that must have opened all kinds of doors. I mean, of course, you went on to, I think you were part of Lawrence Welk's little band. And then so what was going on?
I stayed,
late 50s into the 60s.
I stayed on the show. Yeah. Welk put together this kind of junior band to do a half hour of his Wednesday night show. And so we did that. And Janet Lennon, one of the Lennon sisters, was about my age. So she was kind of like the band singer, and they put the two of us together a lot. I did a lot of things on the Welk show. I stayed on for another 2 years. I played bongos. I conducted the orchestra. I played drums. I tap danced. I did a lot of stuff on that show. And then I left because I wanted to play drums more. And I ended up with Spike Jones' band I was about 16. It was the first time I went to Las Vegas. I was 16 at the Showboat Hotel in Las Vegas. And when I went there were maybe 5 hotels in Las Vegas at the time. I mean, you could literally walk down the strip from the Flamingo and walk another mile, and it would be just open desert before you hit another hotel. It was just amazing. and to look what's happened now, what it's like now. But that was my first introduction to Vegas, and I stayed with Spike for a couple of years till he passed away, and we headlined in the lounge.
Hmm.
And in those days, they had headliners in the lounge like Louis Prima and Keely Smith, and a lot of big singers and band singers and stuff. So to headline in the lounge was a big deal in those days. And so for a couple of years, I did that in Lake Tahoe and Reno and Vegas. And then I hooked up with Ann Margaret and did her first nightclub act at Harrah's in Lake Tahoe.
Hmm.
She was 23 years old and I was 19. And stayed with her for a couple of years. And she opened up a lot of doors for me in the movie business and television business in Los Angeles. I did a bunch of TV specials with her at NBC. And I met a lot of other musicians and contractors, and that's how I ended up on the Carol Burnett show. And that's where I met Bernadette and the Carpenters. And so that's
Sure.
how that happened.
So you were you landed on the Burnett show. Was it around what, 1967 ish?
Yeah, somewhere in there, right around
Okay.
in there.
I thought you were.
I had been doing Jim Neighbors, and I was doing Jim Neighbors' show, and Carol Burnett had her show on. And the drummer at the Carol Burnett show was not getting along with the conductor. They didn't like each other for whatever reason. And somebody recommended me. They said, "Why don't you get Cubby from Jim Neighbors?" So I went over to the Carol Burnett show and stayed there for 6 years.
6 years. Okay.
Yeah,
So, and
yeah,
then, okay. So then now you, at some point here, you meet Karen and Richard. And of course, they were going, right around that time, 72, Karen, they were making that transition from her being behind the drums solely to
right,
now get up, sing some ballads. I mean,
right,
and Jim Squeglia, who was a high school buddy of Richard's, had been playing for a while. That really wasn't working out. They needed to make a change.
right.
So now give us your perspective on how you meet Karen and Richard and how you land that gig and what's that whole experience like.
Yeah, well, they were guests on the Carol Burnett show. Um, like you said, 1972, they had a couple of big hits, "Close to You," and so they were just getting national attention. And their manager came to me at one of the rehearsals at the rehearsal hall and said, "Would you like to go on tour with us during the summer?" Carol Burnett show was going on hiatus for the summer.
Mhm.
It was like our last show of the year. And I said, "Well, yeah, that sounds great. I'd love to do that." And he said, "Because we're trying to get Karen away from the drums. We want to get her out in front to front the band." And she resisted it quite a bit. But
Mhm.
they didn't have anything written down. They were like a self-contained band. So I walked around with a headset on for 2 weeks, and Karen helped me at the drums. And Richard wanted every drum lick to be exactly the same as it was on the record. So for about a year, Karen and I played in tandem with each other.
Mhm.
Karen played, I played, and we played the same drum licks, da 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 da, crash, whatever it was. We were doing exactly the same thing. And little by little, she got away from the drums, and she would play on a couple of numbers because she loved to play.
Mhm.
And we did a couple of big drum numbers where she could really play, and she and I played on "Strike Up the Band," which
Oh,
was a
sure,
big
sure,
number.
sure.
And yeah, then we were really good friends. Karen and I were very close, and I miss her.
Yeah. And I do want to get into some of the personal your personal connection with her and relationship with her. But I wanted to ask, one of the questions and things I wanted to get into, I'm going to kind of go through sort of chronologically from 73 really through the mid to late 70s, which is when you were most active in terms of the live concerts. Of course, you had a couple big trips to Japan. You had the London Palladium, and of course I mean, there was all that history where, of course, where the stage show had been revamped, and that's where you really brought in a lot of, where you guys were doing a lot of the duetting and that kind of thing. And a lot of uh, those scenes and things are up on, they're available on, you see them on YouTube. I think it's the BBC, I believe, replays that show quite often. I don't know if you've caught any of that
Yeah, no, I've seen
stuff.
it. I've seen the the Budokan in Japan. They were hot in Japan. I mean,
Oh
when
yeah,
we landed, there were thousands and thousands of people at the
sure.
airport waiting for us when we landed.
What's interesting though, going back to you made a comment, you said, okay, and I know this to be true, and I've had many conversations with Richard about this as well, that everything had to be note for note recreation. But I have to tell you that there was, as the years went on, there seemed to be a little bit more liberty given to you to embellish and to play. And I know part of that, of course, when you're doing, especially when you are a ballad heavy band and
Right,
you're gonna perform, it's gonna get stale after a while. I mean, unless you do
right.
something to really entertain. There was a level of performance and showmanship that I think that you brought to that band that where and I'm curious to hear this in your words, where you were allowed some freedom because there were definitely some things that you played that you added that were your own that really
Oh,
were the
absolutely,
records.
absolutely.
How did that come to be, and how did you get away with that? Because I don't know that too many other people would have been able to get away with that.
Well, I think at some point Richard realized um, that it was another dynamic to the band that it was. I brought some more show business into the band. I've always thought of myself as a show drummer, and I performed in Vegas and on stage a lot. And so after a while, he let me embellish things and let me play and let me make up my own things to play on certain tunes and things. So I think he just realized to take advantage of this situation.
Sure, sure. Well, and you certainly see that carried over even into, like Merv Griffin and the Tonight Show, some of these late night shows and stuff that you guys played too, where you guys are really, I mean, you're just going to town. And I know that added a whole other level again. When you take a song like a great example is Goodbye to Love, which is
Absolutely.
slow ballad, and then you have this just huge ending with
And
all
the,
this
and
stuff going on in the background, and particularly with the rhythm and and you guys were so incredibly tight, but you were given such a freedom to do that.
yeah,
I don't think that they would have gotten away with. I don't think they would have gotten away with doing things the way they had done them in the earlier years had you not been there musically to do what you did. And Richard had that sensibility, and you knew what you were doing, and you guys worked together, and you could clearly see that there was just sort of an understanding that
right.
that you were really the guy to handle that.
Right. And Karen liked it too. I mean, Karen realized, I mean, she liked drums and she liked drummers. And so, she wanted me to have some freedom to express myself too.
Sure.
And, um, and then later on, like you said, the show became more theatrical. And when we went to Las Vegas, we were doing different things. And Joe Layton did an act for the Carpenters in Vegas. And we were coming in on motorcycles and doing all kinds
Mhm.
of different stuff. So it was becoming more of a show. It was becoming more of a show.
uh, Kind of an interesting. This allows me to sort of tie into my next subject that I wanted or topic really, and that is the studio recordings because Hal Blaine and Jim Gordon and some of these guys were sort of the regulars. I mean, Karen played on the first album. She did all the drumming, and then when
Right,
Close to You came along, that's when they brought in Hal, and Hal was there for the
right,
next three or four, three albums, and then. We get into late 75, and this is interesting because by this point you've been playing with Richard and Karen now for 2 or 3 years.
yeah.
And in 76, the kind of Hush album, there are two cuts in particular. Goofus, which was
Hmm.
one of Karen's favorites, and it really is probably my
Right,
favorite groove song, which of course you play on that, and then you play on another tune called Sandy, and then there were a number of cuts on the Christmas Portrait album in 78, and then the
mhm.
leftover tracks that went on to the 84, an old-fashioned Christmas album. I'll just read them off. Overture, Sleigh Ride, It's Christmas Time, The First Snowfall, I'll Be Home for Christmas, the Winter Wonderland Medley, Do You Hear What I Hear, What Are You Doing for New Year's Eve? These titles will all resonate with Carpenters fans, but you played on about half that album. And what's
Right,
interesting is Richard and I had a going back to 76 with the kind of Hush album. We'll take those cuts. There was actually a third track that you recorded, you did a session for, and then Richard scheduled another session and had Jim Gordon come in and play what became the definitive track. And that is I Need to Be in Love. In
right.
late 75, it was December 8th, I believe, of 75. you and Richard and bassist Joe Osborne went in, you cut a track, and then about 3 or 4 weeks later, Richard went in again with Joe, and this time with Jim Gordon on drums to play that.
Right.
And so I asked Richard, I was at the house one day and I said, I've got a question for you. So what made you decide to, and we got into a conversation specifically about you. I said, with Cubby, what was your take on Cubby as a drummer in the studio versus live? He said, and it was really interesting. He said, Cubby was the thing with Cubby was he was great for certain things. I thought there were things I pictured him for in the studio where he had a feel, where he could bring a feel to it that nobody else could. And where the sweet spot for us, I'm paraphrasing the way he said it, was the concertizing, was the live performance, and all of the big show, the show stuff that we did. Cubby
Right.
knew how to do all that. He knew how to play all of that and bring that level, that energy to it. And I thought that was really interesting because if you look at the tracks, certainly the ones that I rattled off, it's like there was this contrast with you. You'd go in the studio and you would create a feel or something that was really, I mean, all of those really fell back. They were throwbacks, they were standards, they were things that just had a whole different sort of a mood to them in the studio that was completely unlike what you were playing, at least with the Carpenters. It was almost like you were doing the harder rock stuff that you were playing to try to elevate the showmanship and the performance and the live shows. And it always, it's something I always wanted to ask you was, did you ever regret not being asked to play more in the studio, or do you agree that what you were doing was exactly what you were supposed to be doing when in the studio and more on the live scene?
Yeah, I never really thought much about it at the time because I knew Richard liked to use whoever the hot recording guys were in town and that kind of stuff, like Jim Gordon. And so I never took any of that personal. And Karen liked to play on a few cuts and things, and so. But I always felt very comfortable on stage with the show, and that's probably what my best. I mean, I work with Burnett Peters now, and I do the same thing with her. I mean, she's a Broadway star. Right. She does a lot of Stephen Sondheim stuff, but I bring a different dynamic to even that kind of stuff. I make it more theatrical. Sure. I add my own licks and things in it, and she likes all that. So it's much more theatrical and showbiz now than just going to listen to somebody like Barbara Cook or somebody sing Stephen Sondheim stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you prefer, would you say that you prefer the stage versus the studio, or does it really, is there?
Oh, much more.
Yeah. Yeah. What, going back to the Carpenters performances, the live performances, saying, especially around 74 when you guys went and did the Budokan show and that really that whole period, what were those rehearsals like? What were those days like for you guys? Do you recall?
In what way? What do you mean?
Just in terms of the discipline, in terms of, was it an 8-hour day? Was it, I mean, I've heard lots of stories about it was just a grueling, I mean, just to get it right. Like you said, I mean, initially it was note for note. You said you spent a year with Karen in tandem. What was the demand like once you guys got into either at the Carpenters, where do you remember rehearsing?
Well, it was like rehearsing. It was like rehearsing for like a Broadway show or something. I mean, there were long days of rehearsals, sometimes 6, 7, 8 hours with a lunch break and stuff like that, especially when Joe Layton came in and started doing an act where we had to learn lines and learn moves and stuff. And yeah, I mean, and Richard was always the boss, and whatever he said goes. And Karen went along with that too. I mean, he was the guy that said this is the way we're going to do it. But I never felt any tension or any real pressure. It was a very collaborative situation. I thought, he would sometimes, when they would introduce a new number, he would give us a tape to listen to the number that they had just recorded on some new thing. And then we'd get to rehearsal and he would expect it to be like instant. And I said to him once, Richard, let's just rehearse it a few times. It's going to get better and better and better. Like, this tape, I couldn't hear exactly what the drums were doing, and let's
Mm.
just rehearse it. So that's the way we did. He was still very strict about the band playing exactly what was on the recording.
Hmm. When you mentioned strike up the band and the bit where you and Karen were sort of playing off of each other, whose idea was that, and how much influence did you have on Karen or vice versa in terms of who was going to play what and how all that was going to sort of go down? Do you remember? I know that was it's been quite a few years now, but
Yeah. Um, I think, I think it was Richard's idea to do that number. And I think Karen and I worked most of that drum stuff out between the two of us, how it was going to go. And Richard laid out like a guide,
mm,
that first section where she's doing a lot of timbali work and
mm,
cowbells and timpanis and little stuff like that. And then she goes to the drum set, and then she goes to all the big toms, and I'm on the set. I'm in the band with my drum set going. And so there was that whole front section, and then the curtain opens up and the big band is behind us, and that's when we're really kicking ass at that point.
right,
So yeah, I mean, we had to work that stuff out. And the only way to work that out is just to work it out. It's not
right,
written down.
sure.
Nothing's written down.
Sure.
We just had to do it and figure out what we're going to do.
What were if you had to pick one or two of your favorite memories, are there any things that stick out to you either on the performance level or you said you and Karen were close and you had a good relationship. I don't know how your relationship was with Richard in particular, but are there any things that stick out to you that you've never really talked about or shared that just you look back and go.
Well, I always got along with Richard just fine, but he was a little bit more closed off to people.
Hmm.
Karen was much more outgoing, and she liked doing the performing, especially after she got out in front and Bob Mackey started making costumes for her.
Sure.
And she knew she was the front girl. She was what people came to see. And so my relationship with her was um, much closer, I think, than my relationship with Richard. My relationship with Richard was more like he was the boss. I did what he said and what he did, and wanted to make him happy. But I had a more of a personal relationship with Karen, um, a more friendship relationship with her.
Yeah, I'm sure it must have been terribly difficult when she passed on.
Yeah, it
I mean,
was a
yeah,
huge, nobody expected that at all. We knew there were things going on with her physically and mentally and medically, but I don't think any of us thought that was going to happen.
sure. So nowadays, I mean, you're working with Bernadette Peters. That's pretty much that's been your steady now for.
Yeah, since I kind of semi-retired after I left New York, I did um, Annie Get Your Gun with Bernadette, and then I went and did The Producers with Nathan Lane and Matthew Broderick, which was a big hit on Broadway, the Mel Brooks
Mhm.
show.
Uh-huh.
Won 12 Tonys, the most Tonys any show has ever won. And then I left that and went and did Gypsy with Bernadette. And after that closed, after a couple of years of Gypsy, I did Chicago. And then my wife and I moved from New York back to the West Coast in 2006. And at that point, I just decided I was just going to work with Bernadette. And she's been, great. And it's been just the perfect amount of work for me. We go out usually on a Thursday and I come back on Sunday or something like that, a couple of times a month. Something like last year in November and December, we were gone every single weekend. So it was a really busy year last year, but most of the time it's a couple of times a month. And it's perfect for me. And I love her and everybody that works with her in her little group. There's six of us that travel with her conductor and myself and the bass player. And she's got a road manager, a lighting director, sound director, and a personal assistant. So all of those people, we've all been with her for at least 35 years.
Wow.
And I've known her, like you said, since probably 1968 when she was a guest on the Carol Burnett show.
Oh
So
goodness,
I've known her for 50 years.
that's
We,
fantastic.
we
So
were,
you don't plan on retiring anytime soon?
no,
No, no. I mean, why would you? Why would you do that?
not unless I can't make it there, you know.
Yeah, right, right. Well, this has been a treat. I really appreciate this. You know, this is an interview that I've had many people ask. I've done a number of these with the Carpenters entourage and those, you know, close.
Right.
I've been a historian on the subject for a lot of years, and as I said, this would have been such a missed opportunity not to be able to sit down and talk for a few minutes with you about this. And you are so cherished and loved by so many people. I mean, yes, you have all of the Disney, your Disney fans, but you know, in the world of Carpenters, you know, you were really a fixture for
And
all.
you know, with Bernadette, people come backstage, and a lot of people that want my autograph or something talk about the Carpenters. So there's a lot of people that are aware that I was with them, you know.
Incredible, incredible.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's been great, and I'm so glad that we were finally able to do this and get it just a few minutes to kind of go on record and talk about some of this stuff. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate you and appreciate your contribution to their music, both live, you know, on the stage and television, on the television shows, and of course on their records. You played on some really iconic recordings, and I know for you it was another day, it was probably another session, but it means a lot to people who really appreciate great music, and you are certainly one of the great ones. And so I appreciate
Well,
that.
you know, I spoke to Richard maybe 6 months ago or so, and I hadn't talked to him in a long time, but I did want to tell him that being a part of that band was one of the highlights of my career, and I enjoyed being with them. So, yeah, it was a great experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate you. Appreciate your friendship and the connection there. And we'll be in touch soon.
All right. Thanks a
Okay,
lot.
Cub. All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.